So I am the research translation communication lead at Laser Pulse. That means that I get involved with the research projects that we have to provide support on the communication side of research translation, and also to help out with telling the stories that happen from our projects in terms of research translation. So I work with IU. I'm at Laser Pulse, and you can see our website address here, laserpulse.org. If at any point during our presentation you get bored and want to be doing something else while passively listening to me, I would highly recommend that you peruse our website, look at some background information materials, and such could provide some good opportunities for learning moving forward. So a little bit more about Laser Pulse. Don't need to worry about the acronym, but it's long-term assistance and services for research, partners for university-led solutions engine. So we are a very large USAID-funded program to deliver research-driven solutions to field-source development challenges. We are led by Purdue University. IU plays a very strong role in terms of research, translation, and communication in the project. And then we also have some other fantastic partners in the University of Notre Dame, Makerere University in Uganda, and Catholic Relief Services. So the main components for what Laser does, we have created a large global network of researchers and practitioners across regions and sectors around the world. So if what I'm presenting today sounds interesting to you, I would recommend that you go to our website, register in the network that we have, and explore opportunities moving forward. Other things that we do aside from the network, we work to identify research needs in a variety of areas. We do this to inform our RFA process. We have two funding streams. One, our core process. This is where we create our own RFAs and launch them to get targeted interventions going in terms of research translation. We also have a significant number of buy-in funding opportunities that come through where USAID missions, bureaus, operating units will tap into Laser for really interesting projects. Other things that we do within this realm, gender integration, so making sure gender equity and inclusivity are present in the projects and the work that we do. Capacity strengthening along the way for gender, for project management, and then for embedded research translation that I'll be talking about today. So this is our agenda, and the main thing we'll be going through first and foremost is just to establish what is embedded research translation. We'll dive into a couple of the challenges that we found in terms of the collaboration it takes to do embedded research translation. And then we'll walk through a few cases at Laser in terms of examples of research translation and some overall tips for application and some resources. I would ask for anybody who's recently joined, make sure that you mute your microphone throughout. And I want to get us launched in with a poll before I go into research translation. So Michael, if you can cue it up. I'm curious to learn a little bit more about the audience that we have here today. So how many of us here have engaged in research translation projects before? And I recognize I haven't presented what research translation is, so I think this will be an interesting opportunity to see where everybody's at. You can respond yes, no, or I'm not sure, and that'll give us a good reading on where everybody's at. Looks to be about an even split so far, but I'll wait for some more responses. Okay, I think we've hit most people here. So again, it looks to be about an even split with some experience in research translation, some who have not had much experience here, and then some who just maybe aren't quite sure if they have or if they haven't. And that's completely fine because research translation is a challenging concept, and what we've found is that a lot of people have done this without realizing that they have done it, or what it's exactly called. So there are a lot of overlapping terms for research translation. You can think about applied research, you could think about translational research, implementation science, knowledge translation, knowledge transfer, and then some of the older research methods like PAR and CBPR. The basic premise behind this, though, and again, I'm talking here about your classical research translation, not necessarily the model that we have, but what we found a while ago is that it takes about 20 years to go from a journal publication to integration into practice, and this is a study from 20 years ago about how long it takes across various fields. And I mean, this is inconsistent depending on what field you're talking about, but roughly the time frame is about 20 years. So a lot's changed, though, since this study came out. I think a lot more intentional efforts have taken place on the part of researchers, on the part of donors, on the part of practitioners too, to make sure that they have a more intentional effort to get research into practice. Now, generally, I think what you see in terms of research translation efforts still is focused on a two-step process where you'll generate research on a certain topic and then translate it into something usable after the research has concluded, whether that's by means of a separate project or a separate endeavor. It's generally looked at as a two-step process, and there are many other approaches, but generally I think this is what people resonate with is this two-step process. What we try to do at Laser, I would say, is more of a one-step process where we're trying to integrate everything throughout the entire translation process from the very beginning. So it's more about direct partnership with end users. We're trying to embed everything during the entire research cycle, stuff that you might usually think about saving for the end. And this model that we have, it is really effective in partnerships with local government, with NGOs, with private sector partners for research translation. But no matter where you go, whether it's us, whether it's somebody else talking about research translation, generally the focus here is on taking discoveries that are made through science and research into some kind of a format that can be understood and used by a certain actor, whether it's a policymaker or some kind of an NGO or a local entity. And we have a few key actors here in research translation I want to make sure that we're on the same page about, because I think they can be confusing. So researchers, when I talk about researchers during this presentation, I'll generally be talking about the actors that we've engaged in terms of individuals at institutions, higher education institutions in the U.S. and in USAID interest countries, so where USAID works. Again, focusing on the individuals as opposed to the actual institutions themselves. Practitioners is a little bit more challenging to wrap your head around, but if you can think about it in terms of everybody who can play a more direct role in implementation of whatever the research-driven solution is. So this can be non-governmental organizations, community-based organizations. It could also be individuals in the private sector who are helping to take research into practice. Of course, government to work on integration, donors under the right circumstances. So a lot of different actors in here, and you can see some individual definitions below for who these actors might be. If I say translation partners throughout, I'm basically saying practitioners. It's the way that we frame things and the RFAs that we put out, that everybody's got to have essentially a practitioner partner on their project to help out with the research translation part. So this is hence translation partner. And then if I say development stakeholder, a person who's involved in funding, maybe promotion, implementation, could be the intended beneficiary communities, but maybe not the direct partner exactly, more external parties. So what is embedded research translation? this is the model that we have. I'll take a sec to walk through our definition and our graphic here. So we say this is an iterative co-design process among academics, practitioners, and other stakeholders in which research is intentionally applied to a development challenge. So what does this mean? Iterative as in you can try certain things out, try and fail, look at doing different options, testing, things like that. Co-design, working with a variety of stakeholders both in your project and potentially outside early on to make sure that you're all on the same page, that you're all communicating well about what's going to be most effective in a practical sense. And then research being intentionally applied to a development challenge. So essentially, I mean, your output's going to be some sort of a translation product, at least in our model. You create something tangible, but your outcome is going to be more tied to a development challenge, and your impact will be more of a widespread way to address said challenge. So if anybody's familiar with the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, I think our model is probably most closely aligned with their approach for integrated knowledge translation. But what we have here in the model is on the left-hand side, you have researchers, and toward the middle right, you have these practitioner groups, so NGOs, policymakers, private sector donors. There's no reason for having them left or right, but they're both engaged, both sides, in a deep collaboration from the very beginning of the project. So what they work on together is the research question identification. They collaborate on the research itself, establish the context for the project, and then testing any potential solution. So you end up with good discovery, good learning throughout, some kind of innovation, and a field-tested solution in the end. Now, this is the basic model that we have in a lot of our projects. This tail here at the end on the right side is a lot of what we'd want our projects to allude to, getting at this increased awareness through dissemination and providing opportunities for replication and scale and potentially wider application and impact. Of course, these things take quite a bit of time. So generally our project cycles are fairly short. So we want them to get to a stage where they can allude to this tail, but understanding that they can't quite get the entire way. And I would say too, that was a lot that I just went over in the first couple of minutes here. So if you have if you have any questions throughout, please put them in the chat. Michael will help to coalesce everything, and we'll see what we can answer toward the end of the presentation. So if the graphic utterly confused you, I think another simpler way of thinking about research translation is in terms of these pillars that we have. And these you can think about linearly. I think it helps to present them linearly. You have a partnership early where you integrate your partners early on and actively to enable solutions to be more likely to be adopted and applied. You establish a collaborative process for working together, a really solid foundation. You co-design a research translation product, again, something tangible that you can hand somebody to inform them, to influence them, to change how things are working in policy or in practice, and then dissemination. So again, back to that tail, planning for wider application and scale up beyond the initial partnership. You can think about these linearly. I think it helps too. Our model, again, though, is almost everything happening simultaneously. So you have, while you're establishing your partnership, you're thinking about your process, you're thinking about how we want to plan for our product and how we want to plan for our dissemination. So all of it does, it mildly happens linearly, but a lot of it does happen around the same time together. So we did some research to inform the model that we have and the programming that we have. So a lot of varied data sources you can see here in this chart include some surveys, focus groups, key informant interviews, literature review, gap analysis. And so I'm going to spend a couple of minutes here just talking through some barriers and facilitators that we found for people engaging in these types of collaboration that yield research translation. So based on all of the information that we gathered before, and again, this is focused on a lot of the areas that we work in. So there's a heavy emphasis on East Africa, on Vietnam and Colombia as well, and some additional inputs from some other places. But generally what we've found from a lot of stakeholders in this capacity is that researchers and practitioners come from different worlds. They have different backgrounds. They speak different languages, which is really hard if you don't understand what each other are thinking. And again, researchers as in higher education institution researchers, practitioners as in NGOs, government entities, community-based organizations, private sector. Different backgrounds, different languages. They think about research differently. So researchers generally think about creating knowledge for the world. Practitioners will think about how can I use this? How is this applied? General barrier funding is limited toward research translation. Again, we're trying to affect that through our different funding cycles. And then researchers are more likely to participate in collaborations than practitioners. This was a small difference that we found in the survey that we sent out. A small difference, but I think still worth noting that researchers were a little bit more enthusiastic about collaborating with practitioners than vice versa. So basic barriers by type. So for researchers, obviously academic incentives is a big one if you're not incentivized to do research translation. Heavy workloads associated, just a general lack of time to do this type of stuff. Lack of training in research translation. Of course, researchers are trained in their science. Not a lot of training exists. Either during doctoral programs or for faculty in terms of research translation or in terms of how to effectively communicate. Depending on where you go, some misunderstanding with local context and lack of linkages with policymakers. So I pulled out a couple of quotes here that might illustrate a couple of these barriers. So an Ethiopian practitioner noted that we just recommend, present, and then write some policy papers, but we don't follow up after that. Some of the more specific practitioner barriers want to use evidence, but it's not always available to them. They don't have access to journals, so it's challenging to find. It's not always timely. Again, we look back at the time lag of 20 years between when research is done and when it gets into practice. By the time those 20 years happen, the field has changed. Things are different, and associated research might not always be quite as relevant. Want faster results than researchers can produce, and some general power dynamic concerns, I think, on the side of practitioners, maybe not getting the same level of involvement, level of support on these types of research projects. But it's not all negative. There are some good facilitators that can help bridge this process, and we're trying to help bridge this process. Between researchers and practitioners for collaboration, for research translation, for development impact. So recognizing that everybody wants impact beyond academia, it's something that everybody wants to do no matter what they're saying otherwise. Everybody wants impact. Having mutual respect for one another, so practitioners being able to really respect the rigor that goes into good research, and then researchers being able to respect the local expertise that practitioners hold. Flexibility to understand and adapt to each other, because again, different worlds, different mindsets, being able to take a step in the direction of the other party really helps. Engaging at what we say atypical stages in research projects. So we encourage practitioners to get involved during research question identification, which you'd usually think of as just being a solely a researcher function. And then we want researchers to still be involved in dissemination too. So in collaboration with translation partners, working on translation products and dissemination, not saving it just for them, but getting involved, researchers getting involved themselves. A really interesting one here in terms of aligning research agendas with development agendas. I think this could be a really interesting approach, no matter where you go, if you're at a national level or more of a local level, trying to make sure that your research is aligned with what the broader development agenda is in the particular area. And then a couple of things on partnerships. So no need to dive into these too much here, but long-term projects to include stakeholders at community level, and then long-term relationships rather than just having one-off projects. So there are a lot of good things that we saw. Vietnamese researchers saying, I want to publish information, I want to transfer information to the government, I can't just publish. An Ethiopian practitioner saying, research results shouldn't just be shelved. Any project, any development project shouldn't be done without a proper assessment and research. So there's some good stuff, and that's encouraging for us moving forward. What we're doing here is we're trying to promote intentional learning and embrace change throughout projects and establish some flexible project design for teams. As challenges arise, of course, due to COVID and other situations, but we're giving people the flexibility to change and adapt as they go. We're also looking at our model. I had neglected to say we're about 3 years into our core 5-year cycle, so we're essentially a work in progress ourselves, and so we're constantly trying to adapt what we're doing in terms of what we're finding out. And again, the support processes that we have for research translation projects, making sure that they're most accurate based on the information that we have, capacity strengthening as well. Another interesting initiative we're working on is applying this data toward a communication strategy to encourage collaborative behaviors among researchers and practitioners with some key messages. So some basic examples of what embedded research translation is, what this partnership looks like in practice, and how teams are able to overcome some of these barriers. I wanted to pull out a couple of projects from our East Africa RFA cycle. So these 2 projects were, and more that we awarded, were required to fit our model essentially in the application that they submitted and the project that they're doing. So they needed to specify approaches to partnership, to collaborative process, to a research translation product, and then to dissemination. We also encourage them to actively engage stakeholders throughout. So we had requirements in the RFA that they have a local PI or co-PI on their project, someone from that country doing the work presumably already. Needing a translation partner on the award, so having somebody established that has signed off on an agreement to say, hey, I will help you throughout to translate your work into practice in the form of an institution, whether that's, again, an NGO, whether that's somebody in the private sector or government, at least one. And then needing to create at least one research translation product, and I'll get into those a little bit more soon. That's products tied to a certain audience. And then having a plan for dissemination early, so including stakeholder engagement. Now, these 2 projects here, so the one on the left, exploring the use of blockchain technology to enhance food security through African indigenous vegetables in Western Kenya. This is a really interesting partnership between Virginia Tech, Egerton University, and Ag Unity, which is based in Australia. So this mobile app based on blockchain tech is essentially their product they've created, but they're also doing briefs on the process that they've had to inform meetings that they're going to have with Kenyan ministry officials. And they're developing a white paper as well detailing applicability of the blockchain tech in the app to address inefficiencies in the value chain for African indigenous vegetables. The one on the right is on building sustainable resilient supply chains. So this is a model of youth input resellers in Kenya. This one takes place in eastern Kenya. So this is a partnership between Purdue, the Kenyan Agricultural and Livestock Research Organization, and a private sector partner in Bell Industries. And so they're working to identify and train rural youth to become resellers of agricultural inputs in collaboration with local agricultural dealers. So they're expecting this to address rural youth unemployment, reach smallholder farmers, really in the last mile of the input supply chains. So they're testing a pilot right now toward running a full program with 300 youth, exploring how the app can assist groups who face constraints. Now they're working on a guidebook on how to work with vendors and how to engage rural youth. I think this can help with potentially scale and replication down the line. And they're using a really nice co-design approach so far. And so they're working with on-the-ground stakeholders like community-based organizations and vegetable traders as they're designing what they're doing. Now, I'm going to dive in again to the pillars that we have for research translation. And from earlier, these are partnership, the collaborative process, translation product, and dissemination. And I'll give some more examples of the projects at Laser Pulse, mixed in with some general recommendations for how to approach these different pillars in different stages. So for partnership, the model that we've had and the work we've done at Laser Pulse has enabled pre-existing partnerships to continue. We welcome pre-existing partnerships, people who've worked together before, but we are also promoting new partnerships too, so tacking on to either existing ones or creating new ones entirely. So in the previous examples, the two projects that I went over had the research institutions had collaborated before, but they tacked on the research translation partners. So they were a combination of old partnerships, but also new engagements. And so we're hoping that this can lead to more, again, broader, more longer-term partnerships and engagements in research translation and in international development. This case of partnership I wanted to show is from one of our completed projects, and we have 3 completed projects so far. I'll be talking about and a couple of others that are just ongoing. This is a Tusome early grade reading case study, and it was a really interesting collaboration between University of Nairobi and then Makerere University in Uganda, along with Catholic Relief Services. They worked with the Kenyan Ministry of Education and USAID to develop this case study based on how this Tusome reading program was able to scale nationwide. This will help to inform the Kenyan ministry moving forward and USAID as well. Now, this is really interesting from a partnership perspective because if you look at the entities involved, you have a Kenyan university, you have a Ugandan university, you have an American-based international NGO, you have the Kenyan government, and you have the US government all involved. And if you can think about this, this could be a nightmare to do if if you don't do it well. And so what the team ended up with here, I mean, they had a pretty extensive co-design process early on where they had to work together, but they were able to move forward through any barriers that they had through some really good active conversations. Now, here are a couple of tips based on partnership itself. So, if you think about, why would I, as a practitioner, want to work with a researcher? Some of the things you can think about in terms of, leveraging to get practitioners on your same page. Rooting your work in evidence, integrating research into current and future programming, learning about emerging trends in the research field, testing emerging innovations and discoveries, and then co-developing solutions to development problems. So for a researcher, why do you want to work with a practitioner here? And it's really to identify real-world research priorities, enhancing research impact, establishing relationships with key actors, and learning more about what's going on the ground, and then collaborating with field experts on implementation ideas. Now, it's very challenging to do this, though, and so you need to know and understand each other's goals, priorities, constraints, incentives. It really helps to establish clear partnerships early on. And again, this can really take place in a couple of different formats, whether it's formal through some of the projects that we have, having partners tacked on in a formal entity on a grant. But I mean, they can also be informal through either small funding to test a concept, through more more of a consulting opportunity that's more short term, through any kind of academic collaboration. You can also think about it in terms of just networking in general. There are a lot of opportunities to engage researchers with practitioners, and Laser Pulse is one of those areas. Some more general tips here. spelling out roles at the very beginning in terms of who's responsible for doing what, but then maintaining the flexibility where you can have translation partners engaged early, you can have researchers engaged later on in terms of product and dissemination. Assembling diverse teams, adequate local representation, and then budgeting adequately for research translation. We run into this from time to time where you can think about doing something interesting for research translation in terms of maybe creating a brief or a guidebook or a training series or a curriculum, but oftentimes projects don't adequately budget for the expenses that that happen for this, whether it's time, whether it's outsourcing some of this stuff. It's really important to look into the costs that go in here. Collaborative process here, and so again, this is how the partnership works together. This is an example here from our Support to Traditional Cultural Practices in Northern Iraq project. I might pull out the partnership here too between a few institutions in Indiana. So University of Notre Dame, Purdue, and Indiana University have all worked together in a variety of facets before, but combining these efforts with USAID, with the University of Duhok in Iraq, and then the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute leads to a really diverse partnership that they have. And so one of the ways that they've established a collaborative process is again, through getting people involved early. The SIPRI, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, is not just waiting around for the research to finish. They've been involved from day one, informing the directions that the project takes. And beyond just their translation partner, they've been able to employ a number of different workshops and opportunities to get the project additional stakeholder inputs from a variety of different organizations on the ground in and around Iraq, basic stakeholders who need to be able to inform the direction of the research project. So they were able to take these findings based on this workshop that they had, and they're working on integrating this into phase 2 of the project, which is going to focus more on the implementation side of things. And I will say too, the collaborative process can also yield some impacts sometimes. I mean, you usually think about impact in terms of the practice or policy change that you have, but our impact evaluation on psychosocial support in South Sudan was able to really work closely with local organizations, and in doing so, they left a large mark in terms of effectively training youth in research methods. So they left youth there a long-lasting skill upon the closure of the research project. It's just one part of the process. Now, there are a couple of other ways you can think about this. The examples I shared earlier are pretty specific to research translation, but then there are some other ways you can think about engaging with your partners effectively. So again, looking at your goals and objectives, your timelines, overlap, who engages in what activities happen together, what happens separately. And there are a number of different tools that you can look at to help plan out your process for working together. Some of these are available on the LaserPulse website. Others that you can find just with a quick Google in terms of a detailed implementation plan, a RACI matrix. CRS, our partner at Laser, has a great institute for capacity strengthening, and then a teaming science field guide from the NIH is fantastic as well. Basic tips here, establishing this process early, getting researchers involved in product and dissemination, practitioners involved in the research side, local stakeholders or end users involved during the research process too, so your additional parties outside of your partnership get involved early on. And then doing policy dialogues rather than just presentations throughout, so making sure you have opportunities to get insight and feedback rather than just sharing what you're doing. All right, so translation product. This I think is it's probably the easiest way to think about research translation in terms of producing something tangible to inform people. It can be challenging to think through and create those, so I wanted to give a few examples here. This is an evidence gap map from our private sector engagement project. So this is an interactive online portal that they've developed to look at the existing evidence across different components of the cycle of engaging with private sector partners. So there are a lot of different rows and columns here in terms of intersection of research evidence that exists. But this is a tool now that, one, is interactive. People can go in and put stuff in here that they know about. But two, it helps to inform USAID programming. They can see where stuff already exists, where they might not need to create an additional research project to inform, or they can look up things in here to inform what they're doing for for future initiatives. Some other products, you can think about webinars, workshops, briefs, reports, as long as reports are abbreviated and tailored to be used. You can even think about like applied data sets and modeling too, as long as they're clean, sorted, filtered appropriately for people to effectively use without too much extra effort. Training manuals, smartphone application mentioned earlier, potential curricula for education programming. But the fact remains, though, most effectively, translation products aren't added on at the end. They're really talked about early on and deeply connected with the target audience who can impact the change. What you see on the left here, this picture is from our Tusome project I mentioned earlier. This is a briefer that they developed in response to a lot of early collaborations with their partners. They were able to tailor based on the content and format and size based on the needs of the partners that they had. Some basic tips here. Useful to solve a problem, usable in practice, plan for from the beginning in terms of your translation product, actively engaging stakeholders, going beyond just writing up a brief about your project and focusing more on the recommendations, more on the implementation side of things. How can your data be used rather than what was your data? Making sure it's tied to a specific audience, tailored in language. You can do this through, you can do it in a variety of ways through, specific research in terms of, if you think about from a business perspective, like market research on some of the implementing parties or stakeholders who can stand to benefit. What do they like to see? What do they need to see? How do they need things presented? You can do an extensive research study there, but you can also just ask them, what do you need, and in what format do you need, and how can we help deliver that? Last thing is specific to a level, so making sure that what you're doing is targeted toward either the local level, regional, national, or international. What you don't want is to have something that's maybe written for an international audience given to a local entity, and it's not going to resonate with them. One other example I wanted to show here is from our Self-Reliance Learning Agenda project. They were able to provide insights into measuring local level capacity and commitment, focused in Uganda. They developed personas that you can see here to help characterize the commitment that community leaders and members perceive and expect when engaging. So this type of thing can be handed to a field officer at USAID. The project also developed research and evaluation questions, sample indicators, and a participatory process model to really facilitate anyone else who's trying to design local level indicators for capacity and commitment in any area. So they worked really extensively with USAID to determine what would be most useful and applicable across USAID at various levels. Last here is on dissemination. So developing an effective product is really helpful, but it's not everything that you can do. You need to move beyond just a single target application and think about how other people can use this and what other channels, platforms exist to get it out further. If it's effective somewhere, it could be effective elsewhere. So again, audience matters here. Think about what external stakeholders you might share this with and what they need in their programming. As you can see here, dissemination is this tail that we talked about earlier in terms of increased awareness, replication scale, wider application and impact. And it's challenging. It is really challenging, and it's something that researchers are not trained on to do too much aside from the academic channels for dissemination. So this is a really targeted process that needs to be planned for from the beginning. It needs resources, needs time and budget, materials. and it needs a good understanding of who's doing what. Of course, you can do your usual, conference presentations throughout, but there are opportunities where you can share things with ministry officials, with NGOs in a more targeted fashion, or invite them to your own event. So we have a project about armed conflict and violence prevention learning agenda. It's only a few months in, but I think it's a fantastic example of how to do a strategic outreach plan to map out stakeholders. And so what they're doing right now is they're looking at who they need to engage at what different levels, who's most important. They're looking at what periods they want to engage people in over the next 3 months, 6 months, year plus, what data they want to collect on the stakeholders that they have, different types of activities they want to do to bring them together, whether it's learning events, reflection opportunities. They're calling some other things knowledge cafes and chalk talks. They're getting really interesting. But this type of engagement, it's really important to do. It gets your stakeholders involved very early on, and it makes them feel a sense of ownership in the project. And doing stuff early on really helps to facilitate the dissemination later on. And I would say too, from our previous example from the self-reliance learning agenda with the personas on the previous slide, the team was really well able to connect with USAID to facilitate all the findings and products to the right channels throughout. So they went to internal working groups in USAID. They posted stuff on publicly accessible pages on USAID, went on internal and external listservs, newsletters, etc. They were able to do quite a bit. And some additional tips here. So plan for dissemination from the beginning, of course, using an exercise like stakeholder analysis, force field analysis, etc., can really help this process. Using accessible language, we have a training module on this one because it's not the easiest thing to do to not use jargon when you're talking about the research or the impact that you're having. Using language that people are going to understand who are receiving the information. Consider using storytelling approaches, so trying to get a narrative involved, focus on a human element. What's going to ultimately matter to people? How are people going to resonate with this? And it's usually through some kind of a human story or drama, focusing on who, what, when, where, why, and how. Moving beyond your work's general conclusions and focusing on how to use or apply the knowledge. So, I mean, you can have your conclusion section, but really focusing on what the receiving party can do with this. Consider local knowledge for means of effective dissemination too. So I think a lot of people think about dissemination in terms of bigger, wider, further, and a lot of it you can do more internal. In terms of instead of looking at where's the donor or international NGO who can spread this out the furthest, maybe even just getting whatever you found more integrated into the local community that you're in through various channels there, whatever it may be, through through like community-based events, or trying to promote any kind of handouts to people or things like that. And again, I can't say enough, doing all of this stuff early and holding intermittent events to keep people engaged. So that's the model that we have. I can say, again, we're a work in progress. We're roughly 3 years into a 5-year course cycle. We've had some good learning so far. We've had some iterations in the model. What we know already, and we plan to learn and establish quite a bit more, trainings, resources, early research translation consultation is quite effective. Being able to identify key stakeholders, engage them early is effective. Intentional planning early on is really helpful. Co-design's hard. The co-design's frustrating. It's tedious, but you end up with a better product for having done it. And establishing a target audience for products, making sure that you're not just developing a product for anybody to use, you're developing a product for somebody to use. Last up, I wanted to flag some tools that you all are welcome to look into. So if you're interested in the model that we have today, or you want to learn more, you want to stay engaged with Laser Pulse, you can go to laserpulse.org/register. And it'll take about 10 minutes to get your information into our network, and you can keep posted on opportunities and resources that arise around laser. One of the things that I'll plug today is that we have a variety of short trainings, about 20, 30 minutes. You could do some today. They have some templates on research translation and some tools that are available on the Laser Pulse website. So I'll get Michael to post some links in here for the tools and trainings that you can look up. I have some links in here. I'll share the slides after so that you all are able to access. But we've got some good stuff. Introduction to Embedded Research Translation Training. It's essentially what I've gone over today in a lot more detail. Research Translation Implementation Planning template. So if you're curious about how to do this whole process, there's essentially a checklist and fill in the box template to fill out in terms of planning. How to effectively do communications for a research project, both a training and a template there to fill out. How to do stakeholder analysis, how to write up policy briefs and use them effectively, how to use accessible language, do effective training design, effectively engage local communities, lots of good stuff up there. And then we'll look at doing some more tools down the line, so look out in the coming months for additional stuff on dissemination planning, on nudging, on storytelling, and how to integrate research into the policy sphere. We also have, we'll be having a researcher practitioner partnership toolkit, so if you're interested in the partnership side of things, how to effectively engage in that capacity, we'll have more stuff there, as well as some best practice reports and research translation. Some additional resources here I have listed, and again, you can Google these or click when we're able to share the slides. There's a blog, some good research studies on research translation. I would say if you are fascinated by this and you want to do it more, in addition to engaging with Laser Pulse, I would highly recommend the bottom one on the Knowledge Translation Toolkit. It's a really lengthy resource, but it walks you through every step of the process. It's from the International Development Research Center, and they do a really good job of showing you how to do research translation effectively. So that's all from me. Again, welcome any questions that you have. Please feel free to put them in the chat. I'm available if you'd like to ever send me a question, send me an email. You have my contact information here. More than happy to collaborate with you and see again how we might be able to collaborate in and around laser if you're interested as well. So thank you for listening to all of that. I know we have just a couple minutes for Q&A that are still available, but I'd welcome questions. We might be able to go a little bit over time if people are able to stay. So thank you. And Michael, do you have anything in the chat from people?
Not yet. Yeah. So feel free to unmute yourself if you want to chime in or to drop questions in the chat box. And as we said at the top, this will be recorded. And Chris has volunteered to share his slides, so we'll disseminate those. But yeah, feel free to open it up. Thank you so much, Chris. That was really interesting and great. Obviously, a lot of work going on at Laser. Are there any comments or questions for Chris? I have one. Give people a minute to think. So at the beginning, you reviewed the research the Laser team did in terms of identifying barriers and facilitators in collaboration and partnership and research translation activities. And I know you also mentioned that most or maybe all of the Laser supported projects are still ongoing, and so you don't necessarily have outcomes yet. And I think you touched on this a bit in the lessons learned slide, but I'm curious if you wanted to expand a little bit about if and how the model is sort of holding, and if the barriers and facilitators that you identified in your initial sort of assessments are holding true for projects, or are there new barriers and facilitators that are sort of coming up in the research translation process, and how you're sort of keeping track of all of those things with so many projects going on?
Yeah, that's a great question, Michael, and I think I could probably spend another hour trying to answer that one. There are a lot of different ways that we can look at in terms of how the model's holding up. I can say we're measuring things. Our MEL team is able to capture, a lot of output-based stuff in terms of, are people getting the stuff? Are people getting their research out there effectively? Are they generating translation products? Are they doing dissemination events? These types of things. From an output level, we're doing fantastic. I think we're exceeding the targets that we have. At more of an outcome or impact level, again, to be seen. We have 3 completed projects that we're assessing right now to determine what some of the outcomes or impacts that they had were. So we're finding some good stuff. We're using a USAID approach to measuring program and policy change. So looking at where things changed and I guess what changed and on what level in terms of who received things. So I think we've gotten some good stuff so far in terms of, I mentioned the self-reliance learning agenda being shared quite extensively throughout USAID. That one's going to be a little bit tricky to track throughout, but it's really encouraging that they were able to share so widely throughout. Same actually with our South Sudan project. They were able to create quite extensive sharing of what they've done. I think we've heard of a couple of areas where there are ongoing considerations for change and based on what they've produced in terms of essentially what's a pioneer project for impact evaluation in terms of psychosocial engagement in a conflict region. So there are a couple of things that we're hearing so far there, and then our Tusome case study as well, being able to effectively inform what the Kenya Ministry of Education is doing moving forward. There's some good things that we've heard, but a lot more that we still need to wait on. Impact takes time. And our projects having closed in the last few months, where I think we're at more of a stage where we're at an output level than an outcome level, but we're starting to get some of the outcome level stuff. In terms of any of the other barriers and facilitators, I think what we have here still resonates. We've identified what the barriers are, we know some of the facilitators, and we're working through a communication strategy to address those. And so far, I mean, there are other things that maybe come about that aren't accurately represented in the data, but we're working to address everything, get everybody encouraged and excited to work together with other parties for development impact. So I'd be curious too, if anybody is interested in the barriers and facilitators stuff too, you're more than welcome to send me an email and say, hey Chris, I thought this was really an interesting barrier that you found. In my work, I found this. And we're more than happy to take that into consideration too with what we're doing as well. Any additional questions, sir? Yeah.
Yes, sir. You brought up a project about blockchain and pairing it with African indigenous vegetables?
Yeah, interesting, right?
Yeah. Then you talk about trying to explain it to stakeholders at the very beginning of the project. Wow, that sounds like a very big task. Do you know anything more about this? Could you elaborate more about that project?
Yeah, they're really just getting started too. So I think it's a barrier that they've identified, that people don't know what blockchain tech is, especially at a local level for indigenous vegetables. It's not something that's too widely applicable, but the basic premise though is that I think where they're at, smartphone usage is well received enough to where the product that they have is going to be used by farmers, and so they're able to test it out. And so saying blockchain, not saying blockchain, having the tech in there and showing farmers how this can help them I think is going to be their most effective means moving forward. So they don't need to complicate things. They don't need to use any of the tech jargon, I don't think, but being able to show farmers how this can help them, and being able to show local officials how this addresses gaps in value chains is going to be critical for them. But again, they're just getting the ball rolling, and so look out for more updates on them. We'll have stuff posted to their page on the Laser Pulse website as they continue to work.
Great, thanks.
Thank you, Jerry.
Anyone else? I'm cognizant of time here. We're 3 minutes over. I know a number of people had to jump off for other calls, but okay, and we will circulate the recording of this presentation. And again, thanks so much to Chris for taking the time. I think it was really interesting, and I think there's, like you said, a lot of relevance for what we're doing in the Empath research program, and how we can sort of take some of these lessons and practices and adopt them. So we'll have to have you back when in a couple of years when
maybe in person.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah. Well, thanks everyone for sticking on the line. And again, thanks to Chris, and have a good rest of your Thursday.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everybody. Happy to collaborate moving forward. Feel free to send me a note.
Thanks, Chris.